What if I told you that a Viking's worst enemy was not the enemy's axe, but the winter night? When the sun disappeared behind the Scandinavian horizon, a real battle for survival began, where a mistake could cost an entire family their lives. Their homes became complex mechanisms for conserving heat, and sleep was not rest, but a strategically planned operation. Every night required strict discipline, special knowledge, and nerves of steel to live to see the dawn. Watch the video to the end to find out which one non-obvious item of clothing was more important than chainmail, and why your sleeping place determined your social status and chances of waking up in the morning. Want to know the secret that allowed the Vikings to sleep warm when the stones outside were crackling with frost? In the center of the longhouse, there was always a langeld burning, a long hearth that was never allowed to go out completely. It was not just a fire for beauty, but a complex engineering heating system that required constant monitoring and skill. The hearth was built from special stones that could accumulate heat and release it for hours after the wood had burned out. These stones were selected with great care, as the wrong type could explode from the heat and injure the sleeping people. Preparing the hearth for the night was a sacred ritual, entrusted only to experienced members of the community or elderly women. The wood was stacked in a special way so that it would smolder slowly, giving off even heat rather than bursting into bright flames. Hardwoods such as oak or ash were used, as they burned for a long time and gave off the maximum amount of heat energy. The ability to choose the right log for the night was valued more highly than the ability to wield a sword in battle. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light and heat in the huge room, which had no partitions or rooms. Its light created the boundaries of a safe space, beyond which lay cold and hostile darkness. People gathered around this source of life as if drawn by an invisible magnetic force, trying to be as close to the heat as possible. The distribution of heat throughout the longhouse depended on how the hearth was built. The night fire differed from the daytime fire in its intensity and burning pattern, which was critical for safety. During the day, the flames could be high and bright for cooking, but at night, only a smoldering, deep glow of coals was required. This prevented accidental sparks that could set fire to the dry roof or the beds of people sleeping nearby. The person responsible for the fire, often called the keeper of the hearth, hardly slept, watching over the coals. The coals were covered with a layer of ash, which slowed down the burning process and kept the heat until morning. This method, known as covering the fire, required precise calculation of the amount of ash and air access. If oxygen was completely cut off, the fire would go out and the house would freeze in a matter of hours. If too much air was left, the wood would burn too quickly, and the cold would penetrate inside by morning. The ashes also served as an excellent insulator, preventing the heat from rising too quickly and dissipating under the high roof. The heat from the hearthstones spread across the earthen floor, creating a comfortable area at the level of the low benches. That is why all life in the house in winter centered around this elongated stone rectangle. In the morning, the ashes were carefully raked away, and a living fire was revived from the smoldering coals, symbolizing the beginning of a new day. The danger of carbon monoxide was a real threat, so ventilation played a key role in the design of the hearth. The smoke had to rise strictly vertically and exit through openings in the roof without filling the living space. The slightest change in draft could turn a cozy home into a gas chamber, putting people to sleep forever. The Vikings knew the signs of poisoning and knew how to regulate airflow by opening or closing doors. The hearth was the center of social life, a place where legends were passed on and important tribal issues were decided. At night, before bedtime, a special atmosphere of silence and focus on survival reigned by the fire. Everyone understood that this fire was the only barrier between them and the deadly cold of winter. Respect for fire was instilled from early childhood, and no one dared to play with it or treat it carelessly. Losing the fire in winter was seen as a catastrophe, foreshadowing disaster for the entire clan and requiring immediate action. If the hearth went out, they had to go to their neighbors for coal, which was a deadly, dangerous journey in a blizzard. Therefore, each family cherished their fire as the greatest treasure, passing on the secrets of its preservation from generation to generation. It would be very interesting to hear your opinion on such survival methods. Would you trust your life to smoldering coals and the skill of one person? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new dives into history. What if I told you that the walls of their houses were not just protection, but a complex engineering filter? The longhouse of the Vikings resembled an upside-down ship, and this similarity was not accidental, but a deeply functional solution. The curved walls, made of turf, stone, and wood, created the ideal aerodynamic shape for protection from the winds. These walls could be up to 1.5 meters thick, turning the house into a veritable fortress against the cold. Sod was the main building material for insulation, as it was readily available and had excellent heat-saving properties. The grass roots in the sod created a dense mesh that held the soil in place and created air pockets inside the walls. This worked like modern multi-layer insulation, preventing precious heat from escaping. The outer layer of grass continued to grow in the spring and summer, making the house part of the landscape and further strengthening the structure. Inside the house, the walls were often covered with wood, creating an air gap between the cold stone and the living space. This gap acted as a buffer zone, preventing condensation and dampness inside the room. Dampness was no less dangerous than cold, as wet clothes and bedding instantly drew heat from the body. Wood paneling also made the house cozier, reflecting the reddish glow of the hearth and creating a psychological feeling of warmth. The roof of a longhouse was also covered with turf or reeds, sometimes reaching almost to the ground. This created a thermos effect, with the snow cover in winter serving as an additional layer of insulation. Snow, being an excellent insulator, closed gaps and protected the house from the piercing, icy wind. The Vikings deliberately did not clear the snow from the roofs, understanding its value in maintaining the internal temperature. Entrance doors were the most vulnerable point in the defense against the cold, so they were made low and narrow. To enter, a person had to bend down, which symbolically expressed respect for the house and its owner. But the main reason was physics. A small opening released less warm air when opened. Doors were often hung with heavy skins or woolen cloths, creating a vestibule. Inside the long house, the space was divided by rows of support pillars that held up the heavy roof. These pillars also served to attach partitions and create more intimate sleeping areas. The central passageway remained free for movement and access to the hearth, but the side aisles were used for living quarters. It was in these side areas, on raised platforms, that the sleeping quarters were located. The floor of the house was earthen, compacted to the hardness of stone, which allowed it to stay cool in summer and warm in winter. Sometimes the floor was sprinkled with fresh reeds or straw for additional insulation from the cold coming from below. However, the straw had to be replaced frequently so that it did not become a breeding ground for small pests and dampness. Contact with the ground was minimal thanks to a system of wooden decking and benches. There were no windows in the usual sense, only small openings covered with a translucent bull's bladder film. These openings provided dim light during the day, but at night they were tightly closed with wooden shutters. The airtightness of the house was checked with a candle flame. If it flickered, it meant that there was a crack somewhere that needed to be sealed with moss. Moss was a universal sealant, which was harvested in huge quantities since autumn. The architecture of the longhouse was the result of centuries of experience surviving in the harsh climate of the north. Every detail, from the angle of the roof to the location of the entrance, was designed for maximum energy efficiency. These were not primitive huts, but structures that were highly advanced for their time. The Vikings understood that it was useless to fight nature. You had to be able to use its laws to your advantage. And yet, even the thickest walls could not save you if you slept in the wrong place. In the next chapter, you will learn why sleeping on the floor was the right way to stay asleep, and how hierarchy affected warmth. What I am about to show you will forever change your perception of bedrooms and comfort in the past. There was no democracy in a longhouse when it came to sleeping. There was a strict heat hierarchy. The warmest, safest, and most comfortable places were not available to everyone, but were strictly allocated according to status. Beds, as we understand them, did not exist. Instead, wide wooden platforms running along the walls were used. These platforms, called pall, were raised above the earthen floor, which protected against drafts and the cold coming from the ground. Cold air, being heavier, accumulated at the bottom, so sleeping on the floor meant condemning yourself to illness. The higher you were, the warmer the air you slept in, but the more smoke you got. The balance between warmth and clean air was a privilege available only to the owners of the house. The most prestigious place was the closed bed cupboard, or lokrekia, which belonged to the head of the family and his wife. It was, in essence, a small room inside the house, a wooden box with lockable doors. Inside such a bed, a microclimate was created that retained body heat much more effectively than an open space. It was the only place where one could count on complete privacy and maximum protection from the cold. The rest of the household slept on shared platforms, with their heads against the wall and their feet toward the hearth. This arrangement allowed them to warm their limbs, which froze first, but required caution. People lay in tight rows, warming each other with their bodies, creating a single living battery. Personal space was non-existent as a concept. Survival required close physical contact. Slaves and servants slept in the coldest areas, often right at the entrance or at the lower end of the house, where livestock was kept. On the one hand, being close to the animals provided additional warmth from their bodies and breath. On the other hand, it meant constant noise, smells, and dampness, which made sleep intermittent and difficult. Their lives were valued less, and comfort was sacrificed primarily at their expense. Guests were always given places of honor on a raised platform closer to the center of the house and the hearth, which was the law of hospitality. Refusing a guest a warm place was considered a disgrace that could incur the wrath of the gods and the contempt of neighbors. Often, the hosts would give up their places to particularly important travelers, demonstrating generosity and respect. Bedding consisted of skins, woolen blankets, and mattresses stuffed with down or straw. Fur skins were placed fur side down for better heat retention and covered with heavy woolen blankets. Pillows were stuffed with chicken feathers or soft wool, which was a luxury item. Children were placed between adults, in the warmest and most protected place in the middle of the sleeping row. This ensured that they would not uncover themselves in their sleep and would constantly receive warmth from their parents. The elderly were also given places closer to the fire, protecting their fragile health from drafts. The division into sleeping areas was an invisible but unbreakable barrier that everyone knew and respected. To violate this order meant to challenge the foundations of society and the authority of the clan leader. Even in his sleep, a Viking knew his place and accepted it as a given of fate. The sleeping system was a collective effort, where each person was a source of warmth for another. Loneliness in winter was tantamount to death, so expulsion from the community was the most terrible punishment. Like this if you appreciate your soft bed and the ability to sleep alone. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the fierce northern warriors actually slept in? The Vikings had no concept of pajamas or special sleepwear as we know it today. Stripping naked in winter was an unaffordable luxury and a foolish act bordering on suicide. They slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, only loosening their belts slightly and removing the outer, coarsest layers. The basis of their night armor was wool, a unique material that keeps you warm even when wet. The linen shirts they wore in summer were replaced in winter by thin woolen tunics that fit snugly to the body. Wool retained body heat perfectly, creating a micro-layer of warm air right next to the skin. It also allowed the body to breathe, wicking away excess moisture if a person began to sweat under a pile of blankets. Feet always had to stay warm, so woolen socks and wraps were often not taken off at night. Cold feet could lead to cramps and insomnia, which depleted energy before a hard day's work. Some people used stones specially heated by the hearth and wrapped in cloth to warm their feet before bed. It was an ancient version of a modern hot water bottle, simple but effective. Outerwear, raincoats, and capes were used as extra blankets, covering people from above. The thick felted wool of the raincoats was almost windproof and provided excellent protection from the drafts that blew through the house. The richer a person was, the more layers of high-quality wool and fur they could afford for the night. Headgear also often remained on the head, especially for those who slept closer to the exit or walls. A hat prevented the loss of a huge amount of heat through the head, which remained outside the blankets. These were simple woolen caps or thick hoods that did not interfere with sleep. Clothing had to be loose so as not to interfere with blood circulation, which was critical in the cold. Tight ties and belts were loosened, giving the body the necessary rest and allowing blood to circulate freely. A limb numb from the cold could easily become frostbitten, even inside the house. Hygiene took a back seat in such conditions, giving way to the need to stay warm. Frequent changes of clothes or washing in winter were rare events associated with a high risk of hypothermia. The smell of smoke, wool, and unwashed bodies was a natural backdrop to Viking nightlife. Waking up in the morning was not accompanied by a change of clothes. People simply got up, tightened their belts, and were ready for action. This saved precious time and warmth without exposing the body to the shock of cold air. Readiness for battle or work was instantaneous, which was important in turbulent times. Clothes were like a second skin, a protective shell that people wore around the clock for months on end. They absorbed sweat, smoke, and the history of their owner's life, becoming part of their essence. Losing your clothes was as scary as losing the roof over your head. How comfortable do you think it was to sleep in prickly wool without taking it off for weeks? In the next chapter, you will learn how they survived in a house without a chimney, filled with acrid smoke. The lack of a chimney in the modern sense was the main problem with longhouses in the Viking era. The hearth burned openly, and the smoke rose, accumulating under the high roof of the building. To allow the smoke to escape, special openings were left in the roof, but they also let out precious heat. Finding a balance between warmth and clean air was a difficult task every winter night. Smoke filled the upper part of the room, forming a thick cloud hanging over people's heads. There was an invisible but clear boundary below, which the air was relatively breathable. The Vikings lived and slept below this line, literally crawling on the floor of their dwelling. Standing up straight on a bench meant plunging one's head into a pungent, suffocating fog. Constant exposure to smoke affected their health, causing chronic lung and eye diseases. Archaeologists often find Viking remains with signs of serious respiratory damage from soot. Their eyes were constantly watering and inflamed, and coughing was a familiar sound in the nighttime silence of the home. It was the price they had to pay for warmth with their health. The walls and ceiling of the house were covered with a thick layer of shiny black soot that had accumulated over the years. Paradoxically, this soot served as an additional layer of insulation and an antiseptic for the wood. It protected the beams from rot and insects, preserving the structure of the house from the inside. However, any accidental touch to the wall left indelible black marks. In windy weather, smoke could blow back into the house, creating unbearable living conditions. At such moments, it was necessary to open the doors, letting in the frost, simply to avoid suffocating. It was a choice between slow freezing and quick suffocation, which had to be made regularly. The ventilation holes in the roof had special valves or covers that were operated with long poles. An experienced Viking could determine from the sound of the wind how to turn the valve to increase the draft. This control was an art comparable to controlling the sails on a ship in a storm. Smoke was also used for practical purposes, such as smoking meat and fish hung from the ceiling. Products in the smoke layer were stored throughout the winter without spoiling and acquired a special flavor. Thus, a design flaw was turned into an advantage for the household. The Vikings' clothes, hair, and skin were so saturated with the smell of smoke that it was impossible to wash it off. This smell was the hallmark of a northerner, a sign that he had survived the winter in warmth. For them, it was the smell of home, safety, and life, not dirt. Living in a smoky space required habit and adaptation from an early age. Children learned to move around crouched down and not to raise their heads unnecessarily. Spatial orientation in dim light and smoke was an important skill for everyday survival. The absence of a chimney was not a sign of backwardness, but a necessary compromise between technology and climate. A straight chimney would draw too much heat, which was unacceptable in conditions of fuel shortage. The Vikings chose smoke because smoke meant warmth, and warmth meant life. What if I told you that in every ancient home there was a person whose daily work was sometimes more important than that of a renowned warrior with an axe? This was the person responsible for ensuring that the home was completely airtight and for fighting relentlessly against drafts. In the northern climate, a draft was not just an inconvenience, but an invisible killer that could wipe out a family faster than an enemy raid. The slightest, invisible gap between massive logs, or in the turf masonry, could cool down a huge house in one night. This inevitably led to serious illnesses, pneumonia, and death, especially among children and the elderly. Therefore, every fall and winter, a thorough, almost ritualistic inspection of the walls and roof was carried out in the settlement. The person responsible for heat slowly walked around the entire perimeter of the house from the inside with a burning torch or candle in his hands. He carefully watched the behavior of the fire in complete silence, checking every centimeter of the joints. The movement and fluttering of the flame unerringly showed where exactly the thin stream of icy air was blowing from. This dangerous place had to be plugged immediately, without postponing repairs until tomorrow. For this purpose, a specially prepared mixture of fatty clay, fresh manure, and animal wool was used. This viscous mass quickly solidified in the cold, turning into a solid plug that reliably blocked the flow of cold air. Coarse wool or horsehair in this building mixture worked like modern reinforcement in concrete. The fibers bound the clay, preventing it from cracking and spilling out due to sudden temperature changes and vibration. It was an endless and tedious repair process that lasted all winter. They created an additional enclosed air chamber between the ice wall and the living area. The fabric cut off the cold, heavy air coming from the outer logs and kept the precious heat in the center, near the hearth. Beautiful embroidered canvases depicting gods were, in essence, functional insulation. At night, all passageways and sleeping areas were additionally covered with heavy skins or thick fabric. This created isolated small compartments or rooms within one large and echoing hall. This trick made it possible to significantly reduce the volume of heated space. The heat was concentrated precisely where people slept, creating cozy microclimatic zones. Strict heat conservation was the main survival strategy, as firewood was an extremely valuable resource. It had to be conserved because gathering fuel in winter was back-breaking work. The entrance area to the house was often equipped with a double or triple curtain of skins, creating a primitive airlock. A person first passed through one thick curtain, carefully closing it behind them, and only then opened the second. This prevented the icy wind and snow from blowing directly and sharply into the living area every time someone entered or exited. The draftmaster was also responsible for ensuring that the ventilation holes in the roof did not become clogged with snow during snowfalls. If the smoke vent was blocked by snow, acrid carbon monoxide began to accumulate below, threatening the lives of all the inhabitants. In such weather, it was necessary to climb onto the slippery, icy roof in complete darkness and wind. It was a deadly dangerous but necessary job to clear the passage for the smoke. The floor near the outer walls was often covered with an additional thick layer of earth or snow from outside, creating a high embankment. This protected the lower crowns of the house from freezing and rapid decay from dampness. Inside the house, long rolls of straw or old clothes were laid along the walls. This was done to prevent cold air from blowing on the feet, as the floor was always the coldest place. Fighting drafts was a constant battle with an insidious, invisible enemy that was always looking for the slightest weakness in people's defenses. The inhabitants of the north learned to physically feel the movement of cold air on their exposed skin. They reacted instantly to the slightest change in temperature, finding the source of the cold. This developed a special, animal-like sensitivity to the environment in people. Even in their sleep, Vikings instinctively wrapped themselves up more tightly if they felt even the slightest breath of cold on their faces. This habit remained with them throughout their lives, even in warm weather or on expeditions. Comfort was a relative concept for them, but the main condition was the complete absence of direct wind inside their shelter. The skill of insulation and sealing was passed down from fathers to sons as an important part of the science of house building. A well-insulated house without gaps was a source of pride for the owner and the main indicator of his thriftiness and intelligence. Could you find a microscopic gap in the wall, guided only by the slight trembling of a candle flame? In the next chapter, you will learn about the specific materials that saved lives in this icy desert. The Vikings used materials provided by nature, perfecting their use. Turf, wood, stone, wool, and moss were the 5 elements of their survival chart. Each of these materials had its own unique properties, which were skillfully combined. Sod was an ideal insulator, wood was a structural skeleton, and stone was a heat accumulator. Moss, especially sphagnum, had antiseptic properties and was used as insulation for gaps. It was harvested dry and could last for years without rotting or losing its qualities. Absorbing moisture, it swelled and sealed the holes even more tightly, acting as a self-regulating plug. Sheep's wool was everywhere, on people, on walls, in crevices, and on beds. The lanolin contained in the wool made it water-repellent and dirt-resistant. Felted wool was so dense that arrows could not pierce it, let alone the wind. Woven mats made of reeds and rushes were used for zoning and insulating the floor. They created an air gap and were easily replaceable if they became dirty. Reeds were harvested on frozen lakes when the ice was strong, which made it easier to access the thickets. Animal skins were the most valuable resource: bear, deer, and sheep. Reindeer fur had a tubular pile that retained heat better than any other fur. Sleeping on a deer skin meant guaranteed warmth even in the snow, let alone in the house. Peat was also used for heating in treeless areas such as Iceland or the Orkney Islands. Peat smoldered slowly and evenly, giving off a specific smell but providing stable heat. Its extraction and drying were hard summer work, ensuring winter comfort. Charcoal was harvested for smithies, but was also sometimes used for heating in braziers. It burned without smoke, which allowed the brazier to be placed next to the bed. However, this required caution due to the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. Tree resin and tar were used as glue and sealant. They were smeared on joints and cracks to protect the wood from moisture. The smell of tar mixed with smoke, creating the unique aroma of a Viking dwelling. Weaving was not just a craft, but the production of a strategic material for survival. Women spent endless hours at the loom, creating fabrics that would become walls, clothing, and sails. Each thread was a contribution to the overall safety of the family. All these technologies were simple, but incredibly effective and time-tested. The Vikings did not reinvent the wheel. They simply made perfect use of what was at hand. Their homes were an organic extension of nature, not an alien object. Winter nights in the north were endlessly long, and pitch darkness fell treacherously early, almost immediately after noon. To keep from going mad from the deadening boredom, isolation, and oppressive darkness, people had only one salvation: each other's company. Every evening, all the inhabitants of the house gathered around the central fire, creating a dense circle of light and warmth. This was the sacred time of sagas, ancient legends about powerful gods and great heroes, which had been passed down exclusively by word of mouth for centuries. The quiet but confident voice of the storyteller, whether a professional skald or a wise elder, had a hypnotic power. It wove disparate people into a single living organism, warmed by shared strong emotions and experiences. However, this endless storytelling also had a deep, practical, physiological meaning. It artificially kept people awake until it was safe to go to sleep. If you fell asleep too early, immediately after sunset, your body would wake up in the middle of the night. At this time, the fire in the hearth usually weakened, and the frost outside reached its peak, threatening hypothermia. Such forced social activity helped to synchronize the biological sleep patterns of the entire community, so that no one would freeze alone. While the skald's voice was heard, people's hands did not remain idle for a minute. Women monotonously spun wool yarn or mended clothes, while men did minor repairs on fishing gear or engaged in artistic wood carving. The work continued into the evening by the dim light of the flames, but it was more calm and meditative. This created an important psychological sense of the continuity of life and the usefulness of every moment lived. Gambling with dice and complex board games such as Hnefatafl were incredibly popular ways to pass the time. The excitement of gambling and betting warmed the blood, made the heart beat faster, and forced the brain to work at full capacity. It was a great distraction from the oppressive darkness and howling wind outside the thin walls of the house. It was excellent training in strategic and tactical thinking in the cozy, albeit smoky, atmosphere of the honey hall. The evening meal was also an integral part of this unifying ritual. Hot, fatty soup eaten just before bedtime acted as fuel, warming a person from the inside. Abundant fatty food provided the energy needed for the body to generate heat during the long night ahead. Eating together from a single pot strengthened social bonds and gave a deep sense of security. Physical closeness and lack of distance were the absolute norm. People sat on benches, huddled close together. They literally exchanged the warmth of their bodies, creating a living battery. The concept of personal space was not considered valuable. The main value was the physical warmth of the neighbor on the right and left. Children and dogs played on the floor at the feet of adults, feeling safe as part of a large and strong pack that no one would harm. Heated debates and discussions about plans for the coming summer, daring expeditions, and trading trips took place at this time. Winter was the perfect time for strategic planning and bold dreams of wealth and eternal glory. The glare of the fire illuminated the stern faces of people who were mentally sailing across distant seas while a snowstorm raged outside the walls. Hospitality was shown by always giving a random traveler the best place in the circle. Travelers were living newspapers, bringing fresh news from the big outside world cut off by snow. Their stories about other countries were worth their weight in gold, diluting the familiar and memorized repertoire of local storytellers. Psychological support within the community was powerful and mutual. No one was left alone with their fears, longing, or winter depression. The community was mentally united, and one person's mood was instantly transmitted to everyone else. Loud laughter and crude jokes were the main weapons against despondency and fear of the darkness of the polar night. These endless evenings by the smoky campfire shaped the unique Scandinavian culture we know today. It was a culture of firm words, honor, and unbreakable brotherhood, tempered in the smoke of long winter nights. It was here, in the cramped and dim light, that the indomitable spirit of the Vikings was born, ready for any trials of fate. The painful winter dawn in the north came very late, often well past noon. It was grey, dull, leaden, but still desperately long awaited by the inhabitants of the house. Inside the longhouse, the air had cooled overnight, and steam rose from people's mouths. The first to wake up in the cold was always the keeper of the hearth, usually the mistress of the house or the senior slave. Her sacred duty was to carefully rake through the grey ashes and find the sleeping red coals. They had to be carefully fanned back to life and fresh dry fuel, moss and birch bark, added. The characteristic crackling of the blazing fire and the smell of smoke were a signal to all the other sleepers. It meant that the most dangerous part of the day was over. The night had been successfully survived, and life went on. If the fire managed to smolder until morning, it was considered a very good sign and a direct blessing from the gods of the hearth. As the flames grew, the large house slowly began to warm up. People reluctantly emerged from under heavy piles of skins and blankets, shivering in the morning chill. They stretched, groaning and rubbing their muscles stiff from sleeping on hard benches. The hoarse coughing in the morning was a familiar and universal ritual of awakening. It was a way to clear the lungs of the acrid smoke that inevitably accumulated under the roof during a windless night. The first thing the guards did was check the drinking water supplies, which were stored in large wooden buckets at the entrance. Almost always, during the long winter nights, the water in them froze to the bottom, turning into blocks of ice. Strong men had to take axes or hammers to break the ice into pieces. The ice chips were poured into a large cauldron hanging over the newly lit hearth to melt. A hot drink, herbal tea or just boiling water, was absolutely necessary in the morning. It kick-started the body's frozen metabolism and helped warm it up from the inside before starting work. This was followed by the obligatory check on the livestock, the family's breadwinners. Often, valuable cows, sheep, and goats were kept in the same long house, in a fenced-off section or in a warm extension. The animals also suffered greatly from the night cold, huddling together. and their condition was key to the family's survival. In addition, the warmth of the animals' massive bodies helped to heat the huge room, so they were cherished like the apple of one's eye. Inspecting the outside of the house was the next mandatory item on the morning safety agenda. Strong men struggled to open the heavy door to check if the exit had been blocked by snowdrifts during the night. They also checked the ventilation vents to make sure no one had suffocated. Clearing fresh snow with wooden shovels was hard physical work. This work quickly and effectively warmed the men, getting their blood flowing better than any fire. It was also critically important to monitor the roof. Heavy, wet snow could break the beams with its weight. Therefore, it was regularly cleared with long poles, preventing it from accumulating to a critical mass. Breakfast often consisted of reheated leftovers from yesterday's hearty dinner or fresh barley porridge. The food was simple, coarse, but incredibly filling and fatty. It was designed to provide energy for a long and hard day's work in the cold. No one, even in a hurry, left the house on an empty stomach. It was deadly dangerous. Clothes were carefully checked for dryness before going outside. If a mitten or trouser leg had become damp overnight, it was always dried by the fire before being put on. Experienced people knew that wet clothes in the cold would instantly turn into an icy shell and kill the wearer. Leather shoes were generously greased with seal fat or lard to protect them from getting wet in the snow. All planning for the coming day depended entirely on the whims of the weather. If a blizzard raged outside, everyone stayed under the protection of the roof, doing crafts and repairs. If the cold sun was shining, the men quickly gathered and went hunting, gathering firewood or ice fishing. Every hour of daylight in the short day was used with maximum efficiency and haste. Morning in these parts was perceived not as a routine, but as the victory of light over darkness, warmth over cold, man over the elements. Each new awakening was perceived as a small, undeserved gift of fate. The Vikings, who lived on the edge, knew how to deeply appreciate this brief moment of transition from sleep to action. The cycle of life in winter was significantly slowed down, similar to hibernation, but it did not stop for a minute. Survival in the north was a round-the-clock job with no days off, where morning meant the successful completion of the most dangerous shift, the night shift. For the superstitious Vikings, the endless winter night was filled not only with piercing physical cold, but also with blood-curdling mystical horror. The thick, palpable darkness beyond the thin walls of the longhouse was never empty or lifeless. In the minds of the Northerners, it was densely populated with terrifying creatures from their ancient myths and nightmares. The undead Draga, stone trolls, and evil spirits of nature roamed the darkness, forever seeking unwary prey. At night, the world beyond the threshold of the house became alien territory, belonging to the forces of evil, where humans had no place. The bright fire in the central hearth was the only reliable protection against these invisible but deadly supernatural threats. The illuminated circle was perceived as a magical barrier that evil spirits could not cross. Leaving this saving circle of light in the middle of the night meant voluntarily becoming vulnerable to the forces of primordial chaos. That is why heavy oak doors were locked at night with bolts, not only to keep out the cold and wolves, but also to keep out evil. Every crunch of snow underfoot, howl of wind in the chimney, and unexpected crack of wood in the walls was perceived as the real voices of spirits. People listened intently to these nighttime sounds, trying to guess the intentions of the invisible world. The fear of the night was not abstract, but a very real, physically palpable feeling that made the heart beat faster. It was an animal fear of the unknown that made adult warriors huddle closer to the fire. Various protective amulets and ancient talismans were as necessary as a sword or an axe. Thor's silver and iron hammers, hung above the beds, served as reliable spiritual armor for those who slept. Before going to sleep, the head of the family would recite special protective spells, invoking the protection of the Aesir. A sincere belief in the protection of the gods was as important a tool for survival as warm woolen clothing. Dreams in Viking culture also had enormous, sometimes fateful significance, being considered direct messages from the other world. The morning discussion of dreams was an important ritual that could radically affect the plans for the whole day. If someone had a bad dream, hunters might cancel a trip to the forest, and the master of the house might postpone an important journey or reception of guests. A bad dream was seen as a warning from the ancestors, which it would be foolish and dangerous to ignore. But despite all these deep fears, the Vikings were not paralyzed by them to the point of helplessness. Their fear was active and useful, forcing them to be twice as cautious, attentive, and collected. They respected the darkness and its inhabitants, but never bowed down to it in submission, opposing it with their fire and will. The light of the hearth was the main symbol of human order and law amid the chaos of wild nature. As long as a living fire burned in the house, people remained human beings and masters of their own destiny, rather than trembling prey. Keeping the fire burning all night was an act of conscious resistance to the hostile outside world. The unquenchable hope for spring, for the return of the sun, lived in every heart, even in the darkest days. The great festival of Yule in the middle of winter was the culmination of this hope, and the turning point of the whole year. The Vikings knew how to celebrate life loudly and joyfully, even in the darkest and hungriest times, in defiance of death. This remarkable spiritual fortitude, combined with practical survival skills, made them an invincible people. They successfully survived and raised children where other peoples would have quickly given up and perished from fear and cold. Their nighttime routine was an amazing blend of harsh pragmatism and deep mysticism. The story of their winter nights teaches us that light always triumphs over darkness if there is someone to maintain and nourish it. It is an eternal lesson in courage, fortitude, and loyalty to one's home and sacred fire. We have seen that a Viking's night was a real test of endurance, where every detail, from stacking firewood to where you sat on the bench, was a matter of life and death. Their way of life was devoid of the comforts we are accustomed to, but it was filled with deep meaning and an understanding of the laws of nature. They did not fight the cold, they lived with it, respecting its power and finding ways to shelter from its icy breath. This experience of survival shaped the character of an entire people, harsh, resilient, and able to appreciate the warmth of the hearth and human companionship. Their technologies, simple at first glance, were the pinnacle of adaptation to extreme conditions. And today, sitting in our warm apartments, we can learn from them the ability to create comfort and safety with our own hands. Which fact about Viking nightlife impressed you the most? Was it the sleep hierarchy or the use of smoke to preserve the home? Write your opinion in the comments, suggest topics for future episodes, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that history comes alive on your screens.